who are really willing to honestly present opposing viewpoints, who are not interested in sort of playing the role of the yes man. And with Mattis leaving, I don't see many advisors that are remaining that are willing to play that role. Now, that being said, anyone who claims that the United States' civil-military relations is this 240-year-old narrative of harmonious consensus building is wrong, to be blunt. Military men and women have always butted up against civilian politicians and policymakers. And James Mattis is no exception to that trend. We also need to keep in mind the context that James Mattis was the Secretary of Defense. He was not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I would be far more concerned if a member of the Joint Chiefs resigned in protest of the president, because that would signify a far more toxic relationship between the president and the military as well.
Hi, this is Jason Zukas, the host of Have You Heard? The UC3P News Quiz, a podcast where we quiz University of Chicago students on recent entertaining news stories. You can find us on any podcast platform by searching for Have You Heard UC3P, and can find out more about our upcoming live shows at facebook.com/HYH News Quiz. Thanks for listening.
We are going to appoint Mad Dog Mattis as our Secretary of Defense. Mad Dog. He's great.
From the very beginning of the Trump administration, Secretary James Mattis was afforded an unusually high level of respect from across the political spectrum. Mattis is a retired four-star Marine Corps general. From 2010 to 2013, he served as the commander of U.S. Central Command, which oversees operations in North Africa and the Middle East. He gained some attention when he was relieved of that position months earlier than expected due to his disagreement with the Obama administration over Iran. When he was nominated as Secretary of Defense, Mattis had to get a waiver from Congress to be approved. Federal law requires a SecDef to be out of the military for at least 7 years before taking the position. Mattis had only been out for 3. Even still, his nomination was overwhelmingly approved, with only one senator voting against him.
His approach to the job was unique and reflective of his military mindset, in that he seemed to consider serving in the administration as a duty. He's quoted as saying, "When a president of the United States asks you to do something, I don't care if it's Republican or Democrat, we all have an obligation to serve. That's all there is to it, and so you serve."
So I think you have both brought up a very important point, which is there is the image of James Mattis as the military man, and then there is the image of James Mattis as Secretary of Defense. And the Secretary of Defense, which we typically categorize as a civilian role, is typically occupied by other civilian policymakers, which is not to say that we haven't had Secretaries of Defense who have not had military experience. But James Mattis is certainly unusual in the sense that because he is such a military man, at least in the sense that we perceive him to be, that sort of dominates the fact that he is, at the end of the day, occupying a civilian role. So when he resigns, it is not just some random civilian policymaker resigning, which is kind of the formal understanding of this case. This is James Mattis, the military man, resigning, which is why I feel a lot of the concerns of civil-military relations are now being brought up, even though it doesn't actually seem, from a very, very abstract perspective, that the resignation of the Secretary of Defense is all that problematic in terms of undermining civil-military affairs in the United States.
I think it's really interesting how you bring up the fact that he has this one image of him as a military man, and then he has this other image of him as Secretary of Defense, and those two, they should be independent of one another. But, Mattis, who was famous when he was a four-star general, was known by monikers like Mad Dog Mattis or Chaos or the Warrior Monk, and those nicknames continued to be used to refer to him even when he transitioned into the Secretary of Defense role. In that regard, he was bringing along these kind of names that really embodied who he was as a military man still into the civilian position.
In addition to those, there were a lot of policymakers, including the president, who often referred to him as General Mattis. Even when he was in his position as Secretary of Defense, they would say that, General Mattis was making such and such policy decision, or General Mattis. He was even referred to that way in the news sometimes.
Right. It's strange how when you retire from the military and you hang up the uniform, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are no longer a military man or military woman. There's this very formal theoretical distinction between what it means for a military person to get involved in politics. And if we go by the very strict Samuel Huntington sort of conception, it's active duty military officers should not get involved in politics, which is not what James Mattis did, right? He was very much retired at the time. The same applies for John Kelly. But that military experience and the image that we have of them as military officials never really goes away, even though that they are actually retired, right? As an academic, I tend to prioritize sort of the office. And I say this is a civilian office, and the person inhabiting it has resigned. So I don't see much of an issue here for civil-military relations. But I fully am sympathetic to the idea that, well, yes, if we look at the people who occupy these offices and the military experience that they sort of bring to the table, this is a concern for civil-military relations. And I'm not quite sure how we adjudicate that at this stage.
Mm-hmm.
Given the concern that a large portion of the population tends to view someone like Mattis as a military man, regardless of his retirement status, do you believe that it is advisable for him to be taking a civilian cabinet role?
I'm not opposed to it in principle, but from a practical perspective, and this is not the fault of the men and women who join the military, but even when you retire from the military, particularly if you've had a distinguished military career like James Mattis has, you are never really going to be able to shed that uniform. Even if you deliberately try and avoid using your military credentials, other people are still going to view you as a military person, right? So you can have a military man or a military woman who is genuinely trying to avoid taking on the role.
Trying to avoid promoting themselves.
Right,
yeah.
right. So you can have a former military official who's trying to avoid taking on the role of, well, a military official, particularly in the role of civilian politics. But I don't see how either the press or other politicians or the American public are going to view them differently, short of many, many years passing by, and maybe then their military reputation will have receded into the past. But, of course, that doesn't seem very, very fair. And there's obviously no sort of law that says you have to wait 30 or 40 years after your military service before you can take on any important civilian role. I am sympathetic to the idea that James Mattis should be allowed to occupy the role of a civilian policymaker. But the practical realities of, I think, just the way that American politics is structured and the way that we sort of view the men and women that have served in the armed forces makes it very difficult to have this very strict sort of Huntingtonian separation of the civilian and the military spheres.
This discussion about the image of Jim Mattis is also touched upon by Kori Schake in an article she wrote for The Atlantic called The Quiet Integrity of James Mattis. You might remember Dr. Schake from episode 2 of Thank You for Your Service. She is the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and a co-editor of a book on CivMil with James Mattis himself. In that article, she touches on the resignation with two important points: that Mattis's letter, one, defended the American foreign policy worldview of the past 70 years, that of liberal internationalism. And in addition to that, it also, two, recognized the president's right to have a cabinet that's going to advance his interests. She touches on the importance of that resignation letter, and then she also discusses Mattis's career as Secretary of Defense and what his legacy is going to be. She kind of sums it up at the end by saying that Mattis attempted to appoint bipartisan defense experts in his department. He reached wide for counsel, built relationships on both sides of the congressional aisle, garnered the votes of 97 senators of last year's defense appropriations bill, and did well to protect the defense enterprise from politicization against overwhelming force. That will be his legacy.
After Mattis's resignation, Dr. Shockey wrote another article in the New York Times where she wrote that a lot of the president's political opponents, including herself, heaved a huge sigh of relief at Mr. Mattis's nomination because they knew him as an intelligent and measured leader. But she writes, some among us on both sides of the political divide went further, anticipating that the recently retired general would save us from the president and his policies. Basically imagining that Mr. Mattis would be willing to subvert American democracy in order to check what they see as a bad president.
So by the end of the article, Shockey highlights that the president has the right to be wrong, and the Department of Defense has the obligation to carry out lawful orders rather than set themselves up as uniquely virtuous arbiters of the good of the country.
I really like what she wrote here, that the Trump administration is providing a welcome reminder for us that our veterans, like the rest of our fellow Americans, are a diverse bunch. Perhaps this exposure, after decades in which the military leadership was largely left in the wings of public policy debates, will help Americans, the overwhelming number of whom have no military experience, develop a better sense of what the military can and cannot do in a democracy.
Just to close it out, the end of 2018 gave us quite the news cycle for civil-military relations, and it's been a good opportunity for us to re-emphasize some of the most important civ-mil norms, like civilian control of the military. This conversation also opens up some doors to talk more about the politicization of the military. So join us next time on Thank You for Your Service, where we'll do a deep dive into the topic of military politicization and what it could mean for civil-military relations. Be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts, so you'll get our next episode as soon as it's released. And please connect with us on Twitter at TYFYS_podcast. We're eager to hear your feedback about the podcast and the topics that we cover.
This podcast is produced by Haz Yano, Aishwarya Kumar, and Mary Martha Maclay. Our creative consultant is Sarah Claudy, and our publisher is David Raban. This podcast is a production of the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts and is in no way intended to reflect the official positions of the Department of Defense or any other military entity. I'm Thomas Krasnican.
And I'm Nick Paraiso. See you next time.